It was a typical Tuesday morning in the suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek. Suzanne stood in the kitchen, her movements swift and practiced as she prepared breakfast for her husband, Frank, and their two children, Julia and Jake. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, mixing with the sound of children's laughter echoing from the dining room. Frank entered the kitchen, dressed in his usual crisp white shirt and navy blue tie, his hair neatly combed. He was a picture of calm efficiency, always punctual, always dependable. "Good morning, sweetheart," he said, his voice warm and affectionate. He stepped behind Suzanne, wrapping his arms around her waist and kissing her cheek. "Smells amazing, as always." Suzanne smiled, a pang of guilt gnawing at her despite the familiar comfort of his embrace. "Good morning, darling," she replied, forcing cheerfulness into her tone. "Breakfast will be ready in just a minute." Frank released her and moved to the dining table, ruffling Jake's hair and giving Julia a quick peck on the forehead. "You two ready for school?" he asked, his tone light. "Yes, Dad," Jake replied enthusiastically, while Julia nodded, her focus on a book she was reading. Suzanne brought plates of eggs, bacon, and toast to the table, setting them down with a practiced flourish. She poured coffee into Frank's favorite mug, the one with the world's best dad slogan, and set it in front of him, as she watched happily her family dig into their breakfast. But beneath the surface, Suzanne's life was anything but simple. For months, she had been living a double life, her heart torn between her loving husband and the intoxicating thrill of her affair with Daniel. The secrecy, the stolen moments, and the passion had become an addictive escape from the mundane routine of her suburban life. Frank glanced up from his plate, catching Suzanne's distracted expression. "Everything okay?" he asked, his brow furrowing in concern. Suzanne snapped out of her reverie, plastering a reassuring smile on her face. "Yes, of course. Just thinking about the errands I need to run today," she lied smoothly. "I'll make sure everything's perfect for dinner tonight." Frank nodded, satisfied with her response. He finished his breakfast and stood up, checking his watch. "Time for me to head out. Got a busy day ahead." He leaned down to kiss Suzanne on the lips, a brief but tender gesture. "See you tonight. Have a great day, honey," Suzanne replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. She watched as Frank gathered his things, kissed the kids goodbye, and walked out the door, his presence leaving a temporary void in the cheerful kitchen. As the sound of Frank's car engine faded away, Suzanne's smile disappeared. She glanced at the clock, her heart racing with anticipation and dread. In a few hours, Daniel would be here, and for a little while, she would escape the confines of her carefully constructed life. She knew the risks, the potential consequences, but she couldn't stop herself. The thrill was too enticing, the passion too irresistible. Suzanne sighed, pushing away the guilt and focusing on the present. She had a family to care for, a home to maintain, and a facade to uphold. For now, she would play her part, the perfect wife and mother, even as the storm clouds gathered on the horizon of her seemingly perfect life. As soon as Frank's car disappeared down the street, Suzanne's demeanor changed. The mask of the devoted wife and mother slipped away, revealing a woman driven by a dangerous mix of longing and guilt. She quickly tidied up the kitchen, her movements urgent and precise, her mind racing with anticipation. With a glance at the clock, she grabbed her phone and sent a quick message to Daniel, her heart pounding. "He's gone. Come over to our other house across the street." "Not here. I will be there." The response was almost immediate. "Be there in 10. Suzanne's pulse quickened. Then she drove to their other new house that Frank built recently. They planned to move there in next month. She darted upstairs to freshen up, checking her reflection in the mirror. Her hands trembled as she reapplied her lipstick and adjusted her hair. The thrill of the affair had become an intoxicating escape from the monotony of her everyday life, but it also filled her with a gnawing sense of dread. She knew the risks she was taking, yet she couldn't bring herself to stop. The doorbell rang, and Suzanne hurried downstairs, her excitement palpable. She opened the door to find Daniel standing there, his eyes dark with desire. He stepped inside, and the air between them crackled with tension. Without a word, he pulled her into his arms, their lips meeting in a fervent kiss. "Missed you," Daniel murmured against her lips, his hands roaming her body. "Missed you too," Suzanne breathed, pulling him towards the master bedroom. The world outside faded away as they lost themselves in each other. The hours slipped by in a haze of passion and deceit, their stolen moments feeling both exhilarating and forbidden. She felt a twisted thrill in juggling her two lives, the danger only adding to the allure. She tossed the phone aside and turned back to Daniel, pushing thoughts of her husband to the back of her mind. She wanted to savor every moment before reality intruded once again. As the afternoon wore on, Suzanne and Daniel reveled in their affair, oblivious to the storm brewing just beyond their grasp. They talked and laughed, their connection feeling more real with each passing minute. But beneath the surface, the weight of their deception loomed large. At one point, as they lay entwined on the bed while the act, Suzanne's phone buzzed with a text from Frank. "Just wanted to remind you how much I love you. Can't wait for dinner tonight." Suzanne's stomach clenched with guilt, but she quickly composed herself. She typed out a response, her fingers trembling. "Love you too. Your favorite dinner will be ready when you get home." At this time, Frank was ensconced in his office, staring at his computer screen where the live feed from the cameras was displayed. He already installed hidden cameras on his new home for security reasons, and he usually checking those every day as a habit. Suzanne don't know anything about this. Suddenly, the feed shifted. Suzanne appeared on the screen. Frank's vision started to blur with rage and heartbreak. He gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white as he watched the scene unfold. Suzanne and Daniel in their newly built master bedroom and naked in the act, their interactions growing increasingly intimate. Frank's stomach churned as he saw them kissing passionately, their bodies pressed together in a way that made his heart ache. The camera captured every moment, the betrayal laid bare in real time. Frank saw Suzanne's hands roam over Daniel's body, their connection physical and emotional. At one point, Suzanne's phone buzzed on the coffee table. With a mix of dread and disbelief, Frank watched as she picked it up and typed a message. The text was addressed to Frank. "Love you too. Your favorite dinner will be ready when you get home." Frank's breath hitched. The irony of her message, sent while she was entangled with another man, felt like a knife twisting in his heart. The deception was complete, the final thread of trust severed. Suzanne's duplicity, her cold manipulation, was laid bare before him. He could barely process the storm of emotions crashing over him. Anger, betrayal, and profound sadness. As the camera feed continued, Frank saw Suzanne and Daniel laughing and talking, their faces flushed with post-coital satisfaction. Frank drove to home. He has a revenge plan. Frank's message to Suzanne was sent with a cold, calculated precision, each word a blade of betrayal. As he hit send, he felt a fleeting sense of satisfaction, a twisted form of justice for the deep wounds Suzanne had inflicted. The message read, "Isn't your lover's Johnson size enough to satisfy you?" Suzanne's reaction was immediate. Her phone buzzed with the incoming message, and she glanced at it with a casual indifference that quickly morphed into shock. Her eyes widened as she read the text, her face draining of color. The room seemed to spin as she processed the gravity of Frank's words. She looked at Daniel, his satisfaction replaced by a look of confusion. "What's wrong?" Daniel asked, his voice tinged with concern. Suzanne shoved him away, her heart racing. "I need to go now." Daniel's confusion turned to worry as Suzanne scrambled to gather her things. "Suzanne, what's happening?" "There's no time to explain." Frank knew everything. She snapped, her panic palpable. She grabbed her coat and bolted for the door, barely registering Daniel's concerned calls behind her. Suzanne's drive home was a blur of fear and regret. The road seemed interminable, her thoughts a chaotic whirlwind of what-ifs and dire scenarios. Every stoplight felt like a cosmic joke, prolonging the agony of her journey. She rehearsed excuses and apologies, but deep down, she knew there was no way to undo the damage. As she pulled into the driveway, Suzanne's stomach dropped. The house, usually a sanctuary of familiarity and warmth, now seemed ominous in its silence. She fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking uncontrollably. With a deep breath, she pushed open the door and stepped inside. The house was eerily quiet. The air felt thick with a palpable sense of absence. Suzanne's footsteps echoed as she moved through the rooms, her heart pounding in her chest. The once comforting home was now a shell of its former self. Her panic heightened when she noticed that every trace of Frank and their children was gone. The family photos that had adorned the walls were missing, leaving behind bare patches where they had once hung. Drawers and closets were open, their contents scattered as if someone had hastily packed them. Suzanne's gaze fell upon the kitchen counter, where a single note lay atop the polished surface. She approached it with trepidation, her breath catching in her throat. The note was written in Frank's precise handwriting, each letter sharp and deliberate. The words cut through her like a knife. Hope he was worth it? Homeless bitch. You have no idea what's coming next. Suzanne's knees buckled as she read the note, her mind struggling to comprehend its contents. The realization that Frank had not only left but had also taken everything with him, down to the last valuable possession, hit her like a tidal wave. The weight of her actions, the consequences of her betrayal, crashed over her with an overwhelming force. She sank to the floor, her hands trembling as she clutched the note. The house that had once been a home now felt like a prison of her own making. Tears streamed down her face as the gravity of the situation settled in. Frank's revenge was complete, and Suzanne was left to confront the wreckage of her choices. Suzanne's world crumbled around her like a sandcastle swept away by the tide. The realization that Frank had taken everything, their children, their savings, and important documents, left her feeling hollow and bereft. The house, once a symbol of security and love, now felt like a cold, empty shell. Every corner of the home seemed to whisper of the life she had lost, the life she had destroyed. Her hands shook as she rifled through the empty drawers and bare shelves, hoping against hope that some remnant of Frank's presence would remain. But there was nothing, no photos, no mementos, no signs of the family she had taken for granted. The reality of her situation sank in with each empty space, each missing item. She was left with nothing but the stark, painful truth of her actions. Daniel, who had arrived shortly after Suzanne's frantic call, found her sitting on the kitchen floor, clutching the note Frank had left behind. His attempts to comfort her seemed futile in the face of the overwhelming despair that enveloped her. He put a hand on her shoulder, his voice gentle but inadequate. "Suzanne, I'm here for you. We'll figure this out." Suzanne looked up at him, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "Figure what out? Frank took everything. Our kids, everything. What am I supposed to do now?" Her voice cracked under the weight of her anguish. Daniel's face was a mask of sympathy and helplessness. "We'll find a way, Suzanne. We'll sort this out together." But Suzanne's mind was already far beyond Daniel's reassurances. The betrayal she had been part of was not just personal. It had far-reaching consequences that she could no longer ignore. The illusion of safety and stability she had lived under was shattered. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and deeply remorseful. Meanwhile, Frank was consumed by a different kind of turmoil. His anger had morphed into a cold, calculated resolve. The betrayal had awoken a darkness within him, a fierce determination to make Suzanne and Daniel pay for the upheaval they had caused in his life. He had watched them with a careful eye, documenting every detail of their affair and their lives after the split. Now the time had come to act. Frank's plan was intricate and ruthless. He hired a private investigator to keep tabs on Suzanne and Daniel, gathering evidence of their lives together. He wasn't interested in merely causing inconvenience. He wanted to ensure that their lives were as shattered as his own had become. He sought out an old contact, a man with a reputation for handling sensitive matters with extreme discretion. This man, a hitman with a history of making problems disappear, was exactly what Frank needed to complete his plan for vengeance. Frank knew that achieving his goal required a more drastic measure. He reached out to a contact from his past, a figure whose reputation was steeped in whispers of discretion and efficiency. The man was known in certain circles for handling problems with a chilling level of competence, problems that involved making people disappear without leaving a trace. This contact was a hitman named Victor, a name that carried weight in the underworld. Frank's meeting with Victor was held in a dimly lit, upscale restaurant, far removed from the world of espionage and deceit. The setting was intentionally neutral, reflecting Frank's desire for a clean, untraceable arrangement. Victor, a man in his late 40s with a calm demeanor and sharp eyes, listened intently as Frank laid out his plan. "I need this done cleanly," Frank said, his voice steady despite the turmoil roiling inside him. "No mess, no attention. I want them to understand the gravity of their actions, but I don't want any trace of who's behind it." Victor nodded, his expression inscrutable. "Understood. I'll make sure it's handled discreetly. You'll have to trust that I'll deliver." Frank handed over a substantial sum of money, a down payment that spoke volumes about his commitment to the plan. Victor took the money without comment, his focus already shifting to the task ahead. The hitman's reputation was built on his ability to be precise and untraceable, qualities that Frank needed more than anything. As Victor prepared to execute the plan, Frank found himself consumed by a cold, detached satisfaction. The pain of his betrayal was now intertwined with a calculated desire for justice. He watched from the sidelines as Victor worked his methods, each step meticulously orchestrated to avoid any misstep. For Frank, this was not just about revenge. It was about reasserting control over a life that had been upended by Suzanne's betrayal. As Victor's work moved forward, Frank's role was that of a shadowy puppet master, pulling strings from a distance. The plan, now in motion, promised a resolution that was both ruthless and final, a reflection of the depth of Frank's anguish and his relentless pursuit of retribution. Suzanne and Daniel were living under the oppressive weight of fear. They moved to Daniel's apartment, their attempts to rebuild their lives constantly overshadowed by the lingering threat Frank's note had foreshadowed. They moved through their days with a heightened sense of paranoia, their every action tinted with the apprehension that someone was watching them. Despite their efforts to live normally, the sense of unease gnawed at them, making even the simplest tasks fraught with tension. They had decided to go out for dinner, hoping that a change of scenery might offer them a brief respite from the relentless fear that clouded their existence. The evening was meant to be a distraction, a chance to reconnect and forget, if only for a few hours. As they returned home, the darkened streets and empty sidewalks seemed to press in around them, heightening their sense of vulnerability. Unbeknownst to them, Victor, the hitman hired by Frank, was already in position. He had been tracking their movements with the precision of a predator stalking its prey. His plan was executed with chilling efficiency, every detail meticulously calculated to ensure success. The attack was swift and brutal, striking with a ruthless efficiency that left no room for escape. Suzanne and Daniel had just unlocked the door to their apartment when Victor pounced. His movements were silent and practiced, a ghost in the night. He overpowered them quickly, his actions calculated to ensure maximum impact with minimal resistance. The scene that unfolded was one of chaotic violence, carefully staged to create the illusion of a robbery gone wrong. Victor had left a trail of evidence designed to mislead any investigation, making it appear as though a burglary had escalated into a violent confrontation. Items were strewn about the apartment, as if in a frenzied search for valuables, adding to the facade of a botched robbery. When the police arrived the next morning, the site was one of gruesome devastation. Suzanne and Daniel's bodies were found in their living room, the scene a grotesque tableau of violence. The apartment had been ransacked, personal belongings scattered as though in a hurried search. Blood stains marred the once pristine carpet, and the faint echo of violence lingered in the air. The police were baffled by the scene. There were no obvious signs of forced entry beyond the initial break-in, and no clear motive for the violence beyond what appeared to be a botched robbery. The investigation began with standard procedures, but the complexities of the case soon emerged. Surveillance footage from nearby cameras offered no clear clues, and witnesses were scarce or unhelpful. As days turned into weeks, the case quickly went cold. The lack of evidence and the chaotic nature of the crime made it difficult for investigators to piece together a coherent picture of what had happened. The apartment remained sealed off as a crime scene, the air of unresolved mystery hanging heavy over it. Suzanne and Daniel's deaths were classified as an unsolved case. Their lives snuffed out in a manner that left more questions than answers. For Frank, the execution was a grim satisfaction. He watched from a distance, his heart a mix of vindictive pleasure and cold detachment. The finality of Victor's work, the way it left Suzanne and Daniel's world shattered, was the culmination of his plan. The revenge he had sought was complete, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and a chilling reminder of the consequences of betrayal. As Frank sat alone in his dimly lit study, the weight of his actions bore heavily upon him. The news reports about Suzanne and Daniel's deaths were splashed across the pages of local newspapers and flashed on television screens. Frank read each headline with a grim satisfaction, the culmination of his long-simmering desire for retribution now laid out in stark detail. The reports described a robbery gone wrong, a violent end to a tragic situation. For Frank, the victory felt hollow, an empty triumph that did little to soothe the deep ache in his heart. He had achieved his goal of revenge, but at a tremendous cost. The life he had once known, filled with love and trust, was irreparably shattered. His children, the innocent victims of Suzanne's betrayal, were now the only constants in his life. But the bond they once shared had become strained and fragile. The secrets and lies that had torn their family apart lingered in their interactions, casting long shadows over their relationship. Frank's attempts to reconnect with his children were met with a mixture of confusion and resentment. They were too young to fully understand the complexities of the situation, but old enough to feel the emotional turbulence that had enveloped their lives. Their once carefree laughter was replaced by silence and awkward exchanges, each member of the family struggling to navigate the chasm created by Suzanne's betrayal and its brutal aftermath. In the months that followed, Frank threw himself into rebuilding his life, channeling his grief and guilt into productive outlets. He immersed himself in his work with a fervor that bordered on obsession, using it as a means to escape the haunting memories of the past. The office became his sanctuary, a place where he could focus on tasks and deadlines, momentarily distancing himself from the emotional turmoil that plagued him at home. Despite the demands of his career, Frank made a conscious effort to be present for his children. He attended their school events, helped with homework, and tried to engage in activities that would foster a sense of normalcy. He hoped that by creating a stable environment, he could help them heal from the trauma they had endured. As he looked at the faces of his children, Frank was reminded of the love that had once bound their family together. He clung to the belief that, despite the scars and the secrets, there was still the possibility of healing and redemption. The road ahead was uncertain, but Frank was resolved to face it with resilience and determination, striving to build a new foundation for his family amidst the echoes of a painful past. Years had passed since the violent end to Suzanne and Daniel's lives, and the rawness of the betrayal had dulled into a deep, enduring ache. Frank's days were filled with the steady rhythm of routine, and the once overwhelming pain had receded to a more manageable background noise. Yet, as he looked back on his life, the ghosts of his choices continued to haunt him, persistent and unrelenting. Frank often found himself lost in reflection, his thoughts drifting back to the pivotal moments that had shaped his current existence. The days of anger and calculated vengeance seemed both distant and achingly close. He questioned the decisions he had made, the path he had chosen. Could there have been another way? Was there a chance to salvage some semblance of peace without resorting to such drastic measures? The pain of betrayal, while muted with time, still left its mark. The intensity of his initial anger had evolved into a quieter, more insidious form of regret. Frank wondered if there was a path he had not seen, a different response that might have led to a better outcome. The pursuit of revenge, while satisfying in the moment, had brought with it a heavy price, one that extended beyond the loss of Suzanne and Daniel. Frank and his children had endured years of hardship and heartache, but they had gradually found a new rhythm to their lives. The scars of the past remained etched in their hearts, reminders of the turbulent journey they had traversed. Yet, they had learned to navigate their days with a sense of resilience and hope. Frank's commitment to creating a stable and loving environment for his family became the cornerstone of their new beginning. Their daily lives were marked by small routines and rituals that provided a sense of normalcy. The family's evenings often revolved around shared meals, where conversations about school, work, and daily events replaced the silence that had once hung over their home. The kitchen, once a place of emotional turmoil and tension, had transformed into a space of comfort and connection. Frank took pride in preparing dinner, a gesture that symbolized his dedication to nurturing his family and fostering a sense of togetherness. As Frank stood in the kitchen, chopping vegetables and stirring a pot on the stove, he felt a rare moment of tranquility. The rhythmic sounds of cooking and the of a home-cooked meal were soothing, grounding him in the present. He glanced at the clock, noting the time when his children would be arriving home from school. The anticipation of their arrival, the sound of their laughter and chatter, filled him with a sense of purpose. Dinner time had become a cherished ritual for the family. It was a time to share stories, laugh, and reflect on the day's events. Frank had worked hard to rebuild trust and create a space where his children felt safe and valued. He had learned the hard way that rebuilding trust was a slow and deliberate process, one that required patience and consistency. Every meal, every shared moment, was a testament to his commitment to forging a new path. As he set the table and prepared to serve the food, Frank marveled at how far they had come. The pain and regrets of the past were still present, but they were no longer the dominant forces in their lives. Instead, there was a burgeoning sense of hope and possibility. Frank's efforts to provide stability and love for his children had begun to pay off, and he saw glimpses of their resilience and strength. When his children walked through the door, their smiles and eager greetings were a balm to Frank's soul. He welcomed them with open arms, feeling the warmth of their presence and the joy of their company. The dinner table became a space of connection and healing, where the shared experience of moving forward replaced the shadows of the past. Frank knew that their journey was far from over. The scars of their past would always be a part of them, reminders of the trials they had faced. But he also recognized that they had the power to shape their future. As they sat together at the dinner table, Frank felt a renewed sense of optimism. They had weathered the storm and emerged stronger. Now it was time to embrace the calm and build a new chapter of their lives, one filled with love, hope, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow.